I live on a really busy street in my town. The street I live on connects to the highway, and many cars pass through here even in the late hours of night. This story has two parts, by the way. About 2 years ago, I was feeling ill, so I asked my mother if I could stay home. She let me stay home that day with my little brother. I have a large family, and every morning my mother drives us all to school. It was unlike me to stay home from school, so my mother was giving me the special treatment. All us kids packed into the car, and she took everyone to school. That day my mother had a few errands to run, so it did take longer to get home. As we pulled up to the driveway, my mother and I noticed the front door was wide open and blowing in the wind. My mother looked back at me and my little brother with a look of panic in her eyes. She reached over and clicked the lock button, and all the doors of the car locked. She then pulled out her phone and called 911. They told us to stay in the car, but curiosity got the best of my mother, and she got out of her car. Slowly, she went up to the back stairs and into the back patio. All the doors were glass, so you could see right into the kitchen and patio. She placed her hand onto the door handle, and a loud crash had come from inside her house. The sound frightened my mother, that she runs back to the car. She then locked the doors once again, and we waited for the police to show up. Eventually, 2 police cars pulled up into our driveway and they searched throughout the house. But they came out and told us nobody was in there. So my mother got us out of the car, and we all went inside the house. It was weird, because the person hadn't stolen a thing. They had only moved items around. The computer monitor was flipped forwards, and movies were pulled out from the bookshelf. Some of the cases were opened, and discs laid on the floor. I didn't really think much of it, so I laid down on the couch in the living room. My mother was in the kitchen talking to 2 of the police officers, and I was intently playing a video game on my Nintendo DS. That's when I hear footsteps coming from the staircase in the next room. Suddenly, a man dressed in all black had walked down from up the stairs and was now looking at me. He took his index finger and dressed it against his lips. He quietly made a shh sound. I screamed for my mother and she ran into the room with the 2 officers. The man hurried out of the front door that was still open from earlier. The police officers then followed them outside, and I don't know whatever happened after that. I was in tears and my mother was hugging me tightly. I don't think they caught the guy that had come into my house that day. A year later, I was home alone with my older brother. It was late at night, and I was downstairs watching TV by myself. My mother was out with some friends, and she told me to go to bed early. I was supposed to be in bed, but instead I was watching TV. That's when I hear a noise come from the kitchen. The back door was pushed open, and I heard footsteps. Now, we're the kind of family that believes in the good in all people, so we hardly lock our doors. Plus, my mother would often come home wasted, unable to find her keys. The sound gets louder as it gets closer. I could then feel my whole body fill up with fear. The person had opened drawers and thrown them to the ground. After that, there's silverware crashing to the hardwood floor, and I sat on the couch scared to move. The person went into the second living room, which was down a flight of stairs. My older brother's bedroom was in the basement, which was off of the kitchen. He comes up from the basement, and he quietly made his way into the living room where I was. I was still frozen in fear when he grabbed my arm and pulled me off of the couch. We then run up the stairs to my bedroom, and we locked the door. My heart is beating out of my chest, and I started crying. My brother told me to be quiet. I could then hear the worried tone in his voice. Now, just a quick note, my brother is notorious for pulling pranks on me, but something told me deep down that this was no prank. He keeps his hand on the door handle in case the man had come upstairs. The sound continued from downstairs. Plates, bowls, cups were thrown to the ground. After 10 minutes of this, the sounds had stopped. My brother and I sat completely still against my door, until suddenly we heard him right outside the door. The man first knocked. Seconds after, he tapped and ran his finger down the door. Tears trickled down my face as the man quietly made a shh noise. In that very moment, I knew exactly who this person was. Flashbacks from a year ago had floundered in my head. Eventually, he goes down the stairs, and my brother and I sat still for almost 2 hours. My mother finally got home and found us in my room, pale white from what had happened 2 hours earlier. Around 4 months later, we moved out of the house, and we now live in a different town. I try not to think about this story, because it still haunts me to this day. I'll never know who the man was, nor why he went into our house. One thing I do know is the sound of the shh still gets to me to this day, especially if it's from a man. It seems I can never catch a break when it comes to encountering scary people. Honestly, I thought that by going on vacation with my best friend Julia in early 2013, we would have had the time of our lives. Though we kind of did. One night in question almost saw Julia and I miss our flight back home. Here's what ended up happening. We ended up vacationing in a popular resort town in Mexico as a way of celebrating our graduation from university. This would put us at both 24 years of age. Julia and I mostly stayed at the hotel, taking advantage of the spas, the swimming pools, the tanning on the beach, and enjoying the drinks that were on tap. Occasionally, we did take a couple of tours during our 2-week stay, but one night in particular saw us going to a very popular bar/restaurant. It was just across the street from our hotel, and was themed around caballeros, cowboys, if you don't speak Spanish. Anyways, Julia and I head over there at around 9 p.m., and we get in line to enter the restaurant, as it was really packed. Finally, 20 or so minutes later, we find a seat at the bar. We both ended up ordering some strawberry margaritas and some chips with guacamole, as we sat there watching people dance and listening to the music. We eventually joined in on the fun, dancing for what seemed like an eternity, while making complete fools of ourselves. I mean, hey, it's vacation, so it is nice to get out of your comfort zone every now and then. During one of the more fast-paced songs, I ended up bumping into someone, causing their drink to spill. Honestly, I expected to be yelled at for my clumsiness, but instead the man, who was dressed sharply in a dark suit, offers his apology, and then he asks me in broken English if I wanted to get a drink with him. Mind you, by this point, Julia was separated from me, due to the large crowd of dancers. I tell him I already had enough drinks, but he kept on insisting, saying it was his treat.
Come on now, don't be so shy. It's a tradition here in Mexico to buy drinks for others. You don't have to worry.
Yes, the man was handsome and he looked nice, but again, I didn't want to trust a stranger. That's why I start to walk away from him, trying to locate Julia. But he ends up walking in front of me and saying something along the lines of,
Look, I apologize if I came off too strong. I'm the owner of this place, and it's sort of my thing to treat people who aren't from around here.
Alarm bells were starting to ring in my head, but I couldn't explain why. After all, he hasn't given me any sort of reason to doubt him. The only sort of concern I have is that I was in a part of the world where I spoke just enough of the language to make out just a few certain phrases and words. Julia was my translator, and without her, I had this pretty bad confidence issue. Well, I decided to trust the man, and I follow him over to the bar. This was where I meet up with Julia, who asked me if I was ready to go back to the hotel. The man interrupts our conversation, and then he says he'd like to buy us both drinks. Julia then catches up on something that I was unaware of. While I was talking to Julia, the man spoke a couple of phrases to some other men who were dressed just as fancy as Mr. Dancer. I'm going to go ahead and call him that, just to make things easier. Anyways, Julia suddenly says with a concerned tone, Okay, girl, I think that's enough for tonight. Let's get going. She grabs a hold of my hand, and we start to briskly make our way out of the restaurant. Slow down, Julia. What's going on? Don't tell me you didn't understand what the man told the others. No? What did he say? At this point, we're just a 30 or so second walk from the traffic light. He told them we were a great catch, and that whatever they did, they weren't allowed to lose sight of us. or they would be in a lot of trouble. Your guess is as good as mine to what that meant, but things weren't over just yet. Out of nowhere, we begin to hear running footsteps approaching us, and we see it's Mr. Dancer and 5 other men.
Hold on. You dropped your wallet, miss.
We almost fell for it, but I remembered the only thing on my person were pesos and my passport. This was obvious, which was why we booked it to the hotel, half expecting them to follow us in there. Instead, we can see them begin to make their way into a van, where we soon lose sight of them. One of the hotel staff notices that we were out of breath, and then he asks us if everything was alright. We give him a rundown of what had occurred, and suddenly he grows cold and calls over a manager. We were pretty confused, until the manager explained this wouldn't be the first time this has happened. Apparently, it's a pretty common theme for people involved with crime to try and lure and trick foreigners into thinking they can be trusted. Usually, this involves hanging out at bars or parties, where they will try and act nice and try to buy you drinks, or try to get you to follow them to an isolated area. That's where they have fellow partners who are waiting to get you. Julia and I were very creeped out, and we couldn't believe things like this actually happened. Needless to say, we never left the hotel until it was time to head back to the airport. We have never traveled abroad since.
My parents lived next door to a small red house. Our backyard faces the side of their house, which has a deck and 2 large windows. Around front, there are always at least 3 cars parked outside. Oddly enough, in the 10 years I lived here, I never saw anyone enter or leave. Once when I was 12, I saw a shadow thrown against the far wall that was visible through one of the windows. When my sister moved out, I took her room. A large, open converted space in the basement, which had a door and an outdoor stairwell, which led to the backyard. The door had a small window on it, which my sister covered with a Pulp Fiction poster. I redecorated and replaced the poster with some of those sheer half-curtain things. The way the room was set up, if I was laying in the bed or sitting on the couch, I was facing the door. When I first moved down there, I noticed that sometimes at night, I would hear the sound of leaves crunching in the stairwell. I chalked it up to my cat, who liked to roam the neighborhood. I had no reason to suspect otherwise, until a few weeks later. One night, when my parents were away on business, my boyfriend and I were sitting on the couch smoking. Suddenly, he got really stiff and was just staring at the window. I asked him what was wrong and he said, "I just saw a camera flash." I kind of just laughed it off and chalked it up to him being high. Who would want to take a picture of 2 people getting stoned? Still, the seeds of the paranoia had been sown, and it wasn't easy to get settled down for sleep that night. I kept looking at the gap between the curtains. There was no light at the bottom of the stairs, so if someone was really down there, I'd be none the wiser. At around 3, I heard the distinct sound of leaves under heavy boots. Definitely not a cat. I don't know what made me decide the best course of action was for me, standing all of 5'3", to confront the potential stalker myself. I didn't even put shoes on. I threw the door open. There was no one in the stairwell, so I ran up the stairs into the backyard. Standing there was a man in his mid-40s, maybe 6 feet tall, wearing one of those mechanic jumpsuits. He was holding a clunky, outdated digital camera. We stood there for a second just looking at each other. He seemed confused to see me. After what felt like an eternity, I remembered how to speak. "What the fuck are you doing?" My voice seemed to startle him, and he immediately turned. He ran through the backyard towards the red house and into the dark. After that, I didn't see any strange flashes of light or hear any crunching of leaf noises. It really freaks me out to think how many nights he could have been standing out there in the dark, watching me. My boyfriend, who I live with, works as a teacher in town about 15 minutes away by train. He gets home more or less at the same time every day, give or take an hour or so. I, on the other hand, work from home. In late January of this year, we had gotten into a pretty big fight about something stupid. I can't even remember now what it was about, but it was one of those fights where we didn't speak to each other, text, call, or anything for the whole next day. So, this afternoon I was laying in bed, getting work done. It was a Tuesday, and I'm pretty sure his last class finishes at 1 p.m. on Tuesdays, meaning he should be home around 2:30. But around 1 p.m., I heard the front door open and shut. I thought, I guess he's home an hour early today. It was normal for him to skip his last class every once in a while, so I didn't think anything of it. In fact, I was mostly mentally preparing for the awkward post-fight, "Hey, how's it going?" conversation. So I continued to lay in bed and do my work and wait for him to come in and change his clothes. The bedroom door was closed and I had earplugs sort of half in, as I usually do when I'm working. But I could hear heavy footsteps of him walking around the apartment, as he always does. If we hadn't been in mid-fight, and if I wasn't so preoccupied with the awkwardness of it all, I might have noticed that it was strange how slow the footsteps were, and how long he spent walking around the living room. But I was caught up in the dramatics of the fight, and didn't think about it. I was just laying there, waiting and waiting for him to finally come in. Finally, the bedroom door slowly opened, just a few inches. I turned my head towards the door, and prepared to give him a sort of awkward, "We've been fighting 24 hours, huh?" smile. But the door didn't open more than a few inches. I looked and saw that it was a woman's hand with red nail polish on the doorknob. Whoever was there slowly closed the door just as they had opened it, without entering the room. I jumped out of bed, ripped out my earplugs, and sort of froze there for a few seconds, while thinking rapidly. My first thought, that was not my boyfriend. Then I thought, could it have been his mom, his sister, the landlady? For some reason I concluded that it was surely the mom or sister, so I opened the bedroom door and walked into the living room. There wasn't anyone there, but the room smelled heavily of woman's perfume. Then I came to my senses and realized his mom and sisters don't have keys, and had never came over before. The landlady never entered without permission. This was a stranger. I ran back into the bedroom and shut the door, now shaking heavily. There's a balcony connected to the bedroom, so despite the cold January rain, I stood on the balcony and called my boyfriend. He picked up and I asked him if his mom or sister might have came over, unannounced. "No, don't move. I'm calling the police." The police were there in a few minutes and searched the whole apartment. Of course, nobody was in there at this point. It was weird though. Nothing was missing from the apartment, despite keeping a jar full of money right next to the entrance. Nothing was even touched. In fact, it seemed like the intruder came straight into the bedroom, saw my legs on the bed, panicked, and just left. You can't open the big wooden front door without a key. For a few days, my boyfriend and I were convinced that it was a landlady being nosy, and I began to feel a little better. Nevertheless, we demanded the landlady change our locks. When she came to change them with her husband, she made a discovery. There was a square area by the keyhole that had been scratched away with something. The landlady said surely someone used tools to break into the apartment. Then, a day or two later, my boyfriend told me, "I have to tell you something, but don't freak out." He told me that the orange kitchen scissors were missing. I obviously freaked out. I tore the apartment apart looking for those scissors. It's been 6 months and those scissors are gone. So the whole thing is just creepy and weird. A stranger breaks into a nice apartment but doesn't touch or take anything valuable. Not even the jar of money sitting right next to the entrance. Takes scissors from the kitchen, goes straight into the bedroom, sees someone on the bed and leaves immediately. I never got to meet this person who opened the door that day, and I hope I never do. This happened a couple months ago. It feels hollow to put a catchy title on what happened to me because it freaked me the fuck out for a while. I was driving home from work at 2 a.m. I'm a nurse and live in a small city. The roads were totally deserted and it was a freezing night. I don't live far from work, maybe a couple of miles. I'm driving down a residential street around the corner from my house and I see a man laying face down in the street. Now remember, I'm a nurse. My first thought was, great, gotta help this guy up. I was coming off of a long shift, and falls happen all the time. As I slowed down the car, I suddenly realized what an idiot move this was. I'm a 100-pound woman, and I don't carry any weapons. I thought I should do something to help this guy, so I called 911 and drove past him and slowed to a stop at the end of the block. While I stopped at the light, I explained to the dispatcher that there was a man in the road that might need assistance. All of a sudden I hear a loud bang from the driver's side window. I screamed and looked over. A man was pounding on my window, jiggling the handle of my locked car. I looked in my rearview mirror, and there was no man laying in the street. Still on the phone with 911, I screamed, "I'm so scared," to the dispatcher, and I floored it through the red light. I quickly told him what had happened, and even though I was right by my house, he told me to keep driving. After a few minutes I calmed down, and he told me to loop back around. I pulled over down the road from my house and stayed in the car. I didn't see the man anywhere, so I got off the phone with the dispatcher, who told me he was sending the police car to cruise the area. As I gathered my things, I do a final scan of the area, and I see the man. He's walking with two other men. I hunched all the way down to my car until they were far down the road, and then bolted into my house. I don't know if he had ill intent, but it freaks the hell out of me that he wasn't alone. Always lock your car doors, and carry mace.